If the mood music in the run-up to today's EU summit in Salzburg was cautiously optimistic, the final message from European leaders to Theresa May was very clear. Her Chequers plan will not work. The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said it risks undermining the EU's single market. In response, Mrs May said her proposals are the only credible way to avoid a hard border here. So where does all of that leave the negotiations? I've been talking to RTE's Europe editor, Tony Connelly, who's in Salzburg.
Well, certainly the events of today have been very damaging for Theresa May from a domestic point of view. But again, I think you're getting into this realm of vastly contrasting perspectives between the way Westminster and London see events and the way Brussels and EU member states see the process. Clearly, within the British system, within the British media, there were elevated expectations that Theresa May would get a warm reception for Chequers at this summit and that she would be able to make her case for the first time in person with other EU leaders, the other 27 leaders, for the first time since the Chequers paper was published. But if you actually look at what EU leaders have been saying, both publicly and what officials have been saying privately in Brussels and in other capitals, you know, there were always major problems with the Chequers white paper. There were problems with the idea of splitting the single market and goods. There were major reservations about the idea for a dual tariff system whereby the UK would be would collect the EU's customs revenue for them. The EU would outsource its customs rules to a third country. That was always problematic, and they've never made any secret of that. I think the problem is that Theresa May perhaps wasn't anticipating any sharp language from EU leaders today, and when it did come in the form of Donald Tusk's remarks and also President Emmanuel Macron's remarks, it had a somewhat exaggerated effect, and that effect has now rippled across the political spectrum in Westminster. And those hardline Eurosceptics who've always hated Chequers feel that once again they have the proof that Chequers is rejected outright by the EU, and therefore it must be killed dead, stone dead at this moment.
And Tony, does it look to you then as though the Chequers deal is now dead in the water?
Well, I think everything will depend on how Theresa May can withstand the pressure she will be under now. Don't forget, we are facing into a fairly fractious Tory party conference in 10 days' time. Boris Johnson, the former Foreign Secretary, is resurgent. He's turning out fairly critical columns every week in the Daily Telegraph, directly challenging Theresa May. The grassroots of the Tory party over the summer was getting more and more restive and antagonistic towards Chequers, and all of these things will conspire to present Theresa May with a real confrontation in the Tory party conference, and I think she will do well to withstand that. And as I say, Chequers is now really damaged because of what has happened today, not because of the merits of it itself, but because the perception is in London that the EU has rejected it outright. I think another problem for Theresa May is that she came to the dinner last night and said, I've moved, now you have to move. And she completely rejected Michel Barnier's reworked proposals on the backstop. And I think that went down quite badly because for Theresa May to say that she has moved, what has she moved? In terms of what has she moved, it's the Chequers paper. And the EU wouldn't really see that as a major stride forward by the UK. They would see it as perhaps the starting point of a discussion, a vehicle to get us over the withdrawal agreement and into full trade negotiations. But they certainly didn't see it as a major concession by Theresa May and her government.
Tony, just finally and briefly, some people have described today's proceedings as a bit of a bus stop between the leaders. Presumably there are a lot of tactics still at play. Is it simply too soon in the process for either side to be showing, publicly at least, a willingness to compromise? Is that, in fact, what's at the heart of this?
I don't think so, Mark. I think what has happened today is the mismatch in expectations This was never going to be a summit where EU leaders openly embraced Chequers, and I think the expectations were just not realistic on the British side. My understanding from speaking to sources was that there was no intention by Donald Tusk to ambush Theresa May in his remarks on the white paper. In fact, if you listen to his news conference, he said other conciliatory things about the need for both sides to compromise on the Irish backstop. So again, I think this is just symptomatic of the fact that both sides have been at cross purposes, talking past each other over the past 2 years, and expectations not really matching on either side.